The endgame, moral and military bankruptcy. As 1945 unfolded, Germany was collapsing on all fronts. The once mighty Wehrmacht was now a shadow of its former self, battered, exhausted, and overwhelmed. The Red Army was advancing relentlessly, through East Prussia and Silesia, pushing ever closer to Berlin. From the west, the Allied forces had crossed the Rhine and were sweeping through the heart of Germany. The country lay in ruins, its cities reduced to rubble, its people caught in the crossfire of a war they no longer controlled. Yet despite the obvious reality, Hitler refused to accept defeat. His orders became increasingly irrational and impossible to carry out. Cities were to be held to the last man, even when no soldiers remained. Armies that had long ceased to exist were commanded to launch counterattacks. Civilians were conscripted into the Volkssturm, a desperate militia of old men and boys thrown into battle with little training or equipment. Many generals no longer obeyed these orders. They falsified reports, ignored commands, or quietly surrendered their units to avoid needless bloodshed. The once disciplined Wehrmacht was unraveling from within, its cohesion shattered by the hopelessness of the situation. In the final weeks, the discipline and order that had defined the German military disintegrated completely. Hitler raged in his bunker beneath Berlin, accusing his generals of betrayal and cowardice. But even he could no longer deny the truth that had been clear to many for years. The war was lost. On April 22, 1945, during a meeting in the Führerbunker, Hitler broke down completely. He admitted that the war was over and that death was his only escape. This moment marked the final collapse of the Nazi regime's grip on reality. For the generals, this admission brought no relief. They had witnessed the destruction of everything they once believed in: honor, discipline, and the myth of German superiority. Some, like Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl, remained loyal to the bitter end, signing the unconditional surrender that marked the final humiliation of the regime they had served. Others tried to salvage what they could. General Walter Wenck, for example, attempted to organize a retreat to save civilians fleeing the Soviet advance. But such efforts were too little, too late. The moral bankruptcy of the Wehrmacht was as profound as its military defeat. Many of Hitler's generals had shared his contempt for democracy and hatred of communism. They believed that, despite his flaws, Hitler had restored Germany's honor and rebuilt its army. To admit defeat was to admit that everything they had fought for since 1933, and even since 1918, had been a lie. Others were trapped by circumstance. The Wehrmacht was not a monolith, but a vast institution bound by loyalty, habit, and hierarchy. To rebel against Hitler was to betray not just a leader, but an entire system of obedience that defined a soldier's identity. When the first hints of defeat appeared, most officers chose denial over defiance. When defeat became certain, they lacked the moral courage to act. Yet there were exceptions. Men like Klaus von Stauffenberg, Ludwig Beck, and Henning von Tresckow risked everything to end the madness. Their failure sealed Germany's fate. After 1944, the war became an exercise in futility. A slow-motion collapse carried forward by inertia and terror. Millions more would die before the inevitable surrender. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the reckoning began. In Allied interrogation rooms and post-war memoirs, the generals spoke freely at last. They blamed Hitler, the SS, the Nazi Party, anyone but themselves. They claimed they had seen the disaster coming and tried to avert it. Some even portrayed themselves as victims of a mad dictator they could not control. There was truth in some of these claims, but also evasion. Many who insisted they knew the war was lost had continued to obey orders that prolonged the slaughter. They rationalized their complicity as duty. The tragedy of Germany's generals was not merely that they recognized defeat too late. It was that even when they did, they lacked the will to stop it. From the frozen steppes of Russia to the rubble of Berlin, the evidence of failure was plain. By 1943, the war was strategically lost. By 1944, militarily hopeless. By 1945, morally bankrupt. But long before the final capitulation, in the quiet moments between battles, many of Hitler's generals had already surrendered in their hearts. They could see what he could not, that Germany's destiny was sealed not in the ruins of Berlin, but in the arrogance of 1941, when they mistook lightning war for omnipotence and conquest for invulnerability. The tragedy of the Wehrmacht was that it kept fighting long after it knew it was beaten, and in doing so, it ensured that defeat would not only destroy Hitler, but the nation he had promised to make eternal. 1944-45, the final collapse. By 1944, the war was no longer a contest of strategy or skill. It had become a desperate fight for survival. The Wehrmacht was stretched to its breaking point, battling on multiple fronts against enemies growing stronger and more determined. The Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6th opened a second front that Germany simply could not hold. The Western Allies pushed relentlessly eastward, while the Red Army advanced from the east, squeezing the German forces into an ever-shrinking pocket. German troops were exhausted, undersupplied, and demoralized. Fuel shortages crippled mobility, and Hitler's increasingly erratic micromanagement hampered any chance of effective resistance. The generals who had once commanded with confidence and precision were now reduced to executing orders that made little sense, orders that often bordered on suicidal. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding Army Group B, saw the grim reality clearly. Touring the front lines, he confided to his staff that the war was hopeless. "The enemy's material superiority is overwhelming," he said. "Every day we prolong this war is a crime." Von Rundstedt quietly urged Hitler to negotiate peace with the Western Allies. But Hitler's response was fury and denial. The German military leadership was fractured. Some generals clung to the fantasy that the Western Allies might turn against the Soviets and join Germany in a final crusade against communism. But such hopes were delusions born of desperation. Others falsified reports, ignored orders, or quietly surrendered their commands to avoid needless bloodshed. As 1945 dawned, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The Red Army was advancing through East Prussia and Silesia, while the Western Allies crossed the Rhine. German cities lay in ruins, and the civilian population suffered terribly. Yet Hitler continued to issue impossible orders. Cities were to be held to the last man. Armies that no longer existed were to counterattack, and civilians were conscripted into Volkssturm militias. Many generals no longer obeyed. They recognized the futility of the fight and sought to minimize further destruction. Some, like General Walter Wenck, attempted to rescue civilians fleeing the Soviet advance. Others simply waited for capture, knowing the war was lost. In April 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, the last vestiges of discipline disintegrated. Hitler raged at his generals, accusing them of betrayal and cowardice. Yet even he could no longer deny the truth. On April 22nd, during a meeting in the Führer bunker, he broke down completely, admitting that the war was lost and that death was his only escape. For the generals, this moment brought no relief. They had witnessed the disintegration of everything they once believed in: honor, discipline, and the myth of German superiority. Some, like Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl, remained loyal to the bitter end, signing the unconditional surrender that marked the final humiliation of the regime they had served. Looking back, it's hard to understand how men so intelligent and seasoned could have deluded themselves for so long. The answer lies partly in ideology, partly in pride, and partly in fear. Many of Hitler's generals shared his contempt for democracy and hatred of communism. They believed that, despite his flaws, Hitler had restored Germany's honor and rebuilt its army. To admit defeat was to admit that everything they had fought for since 1933, and even since 1918, had been a lie. Others were trapped by circumstance. The Wehrmacht was not a monolith, but a vast institution bound by loyalty, habit, and hierarchy. To rebel against Hitler was to betray not just a leader, but an entire system of obedience that defined a soldier's identity. When the first hints of defeat appeared, most officers chose denial over defiance. When defeat became certain, they lacked the moral courage to act. Yet there were exceptions. Men like Klaus von Stauffenberg, Ludwig Beck, and Henning von Treschow risked everything to end the madness. Their failure sealed Germany's fate. After 1944, the war became an exercise in futility, a slow-motion collapse carried forward by inertia and terror. Millions more would die before the inevitable surrender. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the reckoning began. In Allied interrogation rooms and post-war memoirs, the generals spoke freely at last. They blamed Hitler, the SS, the Nazi Party, anyone but themselves. They claimed they had seen the disaster coming and tried to avert it. Some even portrayed themselves as victims of a mad dictator they could not control. There was truth in some of these claims, but also evasion. Many who insisted they knew the war was lost had continued to obey orders that prolonged the slaughter. They rationalized their complicity as duty. The tragedy of Germany's generals was not merely that they recognized defeat too late. It was that even when they did, they lacked the will to stop it. From the frozen steppes of Russia to the rubble of Berlin, the evidence of failure was plain. By 1943, the war was strategically lost. By 1944, militarily hopeless. By 1945, morally bankrupt. But long before the final capitulation, in the quiet moments between battles, many of Hitler's generals had already surrendered in their hearts. They could see what he could not, that Germany's destiny was sealed not in the ruins of Berlin, but in the arrogance of 1941, when they mistook lightning war for omnipotence and conquest for invulnerability. The tragedy of the Wehrmacht was that it kept fighting long after it knew it was beaten. And in doing so, it ensured that defeat would not only destroy Hitler, but the nation he had promised to make eternal. Internal collapse and the July 20th plot by 1943 and into 1944, the cracks within the German military and political leadership were no longer hidden. The Wehrmacht was fighting a losing battle on multiple fronts, but the real struggle was happening behind the scenes, in the hearts and minds of the generals themselves. The early arrogance and confidence had given way to despair, fear, and quiet resistance. The war was unraveling, and with it, the loyalty that had once bound the officer corps to Hitler's vision. The mood inside the German high command had shifted dramatically. The generals who had once preached blind loyalty now spoke in cautious tones about saving what could be saved. The reality was grim. German industry could no longer replace losses fast enough. Allied bombers ruled the skies, and the U-boat fleet was being decimated in the Atlantic. The Wehrmacht was stretched thin, its resources dwindling and its morale breaking. Amid this growing desperation, a dangerous idea began to take hold among some of the highest-ranking officers. Removing Hitler was no longer just a whispered fantasy, it became a serious consideration. Men like Klaus von Stauffenberg, Henning von Treschow, and Ludwig Beck were not merely idealists disgusted by Nazi crimes. They were professional soldiers convinced that Hitler was leading Germany to destruction. To kill him, they reasoned, was not treason. It was salvation. But such thoughts were treacherous. The Gestapo's reach was everywhere, and dissent, even in private, could mean death. For most officers, it was easier to remain silent, to tell themselves that perhaps the tide might yet turn. Some placed hope in new weapons, others in a rift between the Western Allies and the Soviets. But beneath every rationalization lay the same buried truth. The war was lost. The most dramatic expression of this internal collapse came on July 20th, 1944. Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators planted a bomb at Hitler's East Prussian headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, hoping to end the war by assassinating the Führer. The explosion killed several officers but failed to kill Hitler. The plot unraveled quickly, and the consequences were brutal. In the aftermath, the regime cracked down with ruthless efficiency. Thousands were arrested, tortured, and executed. The officer corps was decimated by its own despair. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, suspected of involvement, was forced to take his own life. Others, like General Friedrich Olbricht and Colonel Albrecht Merz von Quirnheim, were executed outright. The failed assassination attempt sent a chilling message. Any hope of internal reform or military salvation was extinguished. The surviving generals, understood that the regime would destroy itself and them along with it. Still, they continued to fight, partly out of duty, partly out of fear. The war was no longer about victory. It was about survival. The officers who had once commanded with confidence were now reduced to executing suicidal orders dictated from distant map rooms. The July 20th plot was a turning point, not just in the war, but in the moral collapse of the German military. It revealed the deep fractures within the officer corps and the limits of resistance under a totalitarian regime. The generals who had once believed in the cause now faced the bitter truth that they were trapped in a nightmare of their own making. As 1944 wore on, the Wehrmacht's situation grew increasingly desperate. The Western Allies landed in Normandy on June 6th, opening a second front that Germany could ill afford. German forces were overstretched, short of fuel, and hampered by Hitler's micromanagement. The generals who had once prided themselves on maneuver warfare were now reduced to carrying out orders that made no strategic sense. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding Army Group B, saw the situation clearly. Touring the front lines, he confided to his staff that the war was hopeless. "The enemy's material superiority is overwhelming," he said. "Every day we prolong this war is a crime." Von Rundstedt quietly urged Hitler to negotiate peace with the Western Allies. But Hitler's response was fury. The internal collapse of the German military leadership was complete. The officer corps was fractured, demoralized, and powerless to change the course of the war. The failed July 20th plot was the last desperate attempt to alter Germany's fate, and its failure sealed the doom of the regime. Yet even in the face of inevitable defeat, many generals continued to fight. Some falsified reports, others ignored orders, and a few quietly surrendered their commands. But the war was no longer about strategy or honor. It was a slow-motion collapse carried forward by inertia, fear, and the remnants of loyalty. The tragedy of the Wehrmacht was not just that it lost the war, but that it lost itself in the process. The internal collapse and the failed July 20th plot revealed a military leadership caught between duty and despair, loyalty and resistance, hope and hopelessness. It was a moral and strategic failure that echoed through the final years of the conflict. The 1942 campaign and Stalingrad disaster by 1942. The Wehrmacht was desperate to regain the momentum it had lost during the brutal winter of 1941. Hitler demanded renewed offensives, convinced that a bold push could still turn the tide of the war. The plan was ambitious, perhaps recklessly so. The German army would split its forces, sending one group toward the oil-rich Caucasus region and another toward the city of Stalingrad, a vital industrial hub on the Volga River. This dual offensive was meant to secure critical resources and cripple the Soviet war machine. But the generals were uneasy. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group South, warned that dividing the army's strength across such vast distances was a dangerous gamble. He foresaw the risks of overstretched supply lines and the difficulty of coordinating two massive offensives simultaneously. His concerns were dismissed by Hitler, who snapped, "You always see black clouds." Von Bock was soon relieved of his command, replaced by officers more willing to follow orders without question. As the panzers rolled southward, many officers quietly recognized the flaws in the plan. The distances were immense, the terrain difficult, and the Soviet forces were learning and adapting. The Red Army was no longer the disorganized force it had been in 1941. It had rebuilt, rearmed, and was ready to fight fiercely for every inch of ground. The battle for Stalingrad quickly became a nightmare. What was supposed to be a swift capture turned into brutal street fighting. The Soviets refused to yield, turning the city into a fortress. Reports from the front painted a desperate picture. German troops were exhausted, supplies were running low, and the enemy was relentless. Then came the encirclement. In November 1942, Soviet forces launched a massive counterattack, surrounding the German Sixth Army inside Stalingrad. The news stunned Berlin, but not the officers who had seen the warning signs. For the first time, an entire German field army was trapped and doomed. Inside the frozen city, General Friedrich Paulus maintained radio contact with Hitler, pleading for permission to attempt a breakout. None came. Hitler ordered the army to hold its ground, promising relief that never arrived. The Sixth Army was left to perish where it stood. The psychological impact was devastating. Stalingrad shattered the myth of German invincibility. Officers who had once scoffed at the idea of defeat now faced it in its purest form. The unspoken question spread like wildfire. If this could happen to the finest army Germany had ever fielded, what hope remained? The disaster at Stalingrad marked a turning point in the war. It was not just a military defeat, but a blow to the morale and spirit of the Wehrmacht. The generals who had once believed in swift victory now faced the harsh reality of a protracted, losing battle. Despite the catastrophe, Hitler refused to admit defeat. He continued to issue impossible orders, demanding counterattacks and holding positions that no longer existed. The generals obeyed, but their confidence was hollow. The war was slipping away, and they knew it. Stalingrad was the beginning of the end. It exposed the fatal flaws in German strategy: overreach, underestimation of the enemy, and blind loyalty to a leader who refused to face reality. The war was no longer a campaign of conquest. It was a desperate struggle for survival. As the winter of 1942-43 set in, the Wehrmacht was battered and broken. The loss at Stalingrad was a wound that would never fully heal. It was a stark reminder that the war was far from over, and that the price of failure would be paid in blood. Kursk and the last gamble, by the spring of 1943, the Wehrmacht was desperate to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. After the devastating loss at Stalingrad, the German High Command planned one final, massive offensive to restore their battered reputation and halt the Soviet advance. This operation would become the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history and the last great gamble of the German army. The plan was bold: to strike a decisive blow against the Soviet forces entrenched around the Kursk salient, a bulge in the front lines that jutted deep into German-held territory. The goal was to encircle and destroy the Soviet armies there, crippling their ability to launch further offensives. Success at Kursk could have changed the course of the war, but the generals privately harbored serious doubts. Intelligence reports had warned that the Soviets were heavily fortified and well prepared. They had built extensive defensive networks, including minefields, anti-tank obstacles, and deep trenches. The element of surprise was gone. The Red Army had learned from past defeats and was ready to meet the German assault head-on. Despite these warnings, Hitler insisted on pressing forward. The offensive began in July 1943 with massive artillery barrages and waves of tanks rolling toward Soviet lines. The initial attacks made some gains, but the German forces soon encountered fierce resistance. The Soviet defenses held firm, and the battle quickly devolved into a brutal slugfest. The fighting at Kursk was intense and costly. German armor was decimated by well-prepared Soviet anti-tank units and relentless counterattacks. The Wehrmacht's losses were staggering, and the offensive ground to a halt. When the attack finally collapsed, it was clear that the Germans would not achieve the decisive victory they had hoped for. Kursk marked the end of Germany's ability to launch major offensives on the Eastern Front. From this point on, the Wehrmacht was forced into a defensive posture, fighting a retreating war against an enemy growing stronger by the day. The generals, once confident in their ability to dictate the pace of the conflict, now faced the harsh reality that the war was lost. The failure at Kursk also had a profound psychological impact. It shattered any remaining illusions of German invincibility and exposed the limits of Hitler's strategic vision. The generals who had once believed in swift, decisive victories now understood that the war was slipping beyond their control. Hitler, however, refused to accept defeat. He continued to rant about miracle weapons and the indomitable will of the German soldier, clinging to fantasies even as the reality on the ground grew bleaker. The generals, meanwhile, read the maps and saw the inexorable advance of the Red Army westward. The Western Allies were preparing to open a second front, and the pressure on Germany was mounting from all sides. The war was no longer about conquest or glory, it was about survival. The mood within the German officer corps shifted from arrogance to quiet fatalism. Kursk was the last great gamble, and its failure sealed the strategic outcome of the war. The Wehrmacht could no longer win. The generals knew it, even if Hitler refused to admit it. From this point forward, the war would be a slow, painful retreat, marked by desperation and loss. The battle also highlighted the growing divide between Hitler and his generals. Many officers privately questioned his decisions and foresaw the inevitable collapse. Some began to contemplate drastic measures, including removing Hitler from power. But such thoughts were dangerous, and the Gestapo's shadow loomed large. As the summer of 1943 ended, the Wehrmacht was battered but still fighting. The war was far from over, but the tide had clearly turned. The last great offensive had failed, and the generals faced the grim task of managing a retreat that would cost millions of lives. Kursk was not just a battle. It was a symbol of Germany's lost chance. It marked the moment when the Wehrmacht's fate was sealed, not by a single defeat, but by the slow, relentless erosion of strength and will. The war was lost, and the generals knew it. The silent realization and the zenith of power. They whispered it first in quiet corners, officers' messes. Guarded letters home, long before the bombs fell on Dresden or Hitler's pistol echoed in the Berlin bunker. Some of Germany's most capable generals already knew the truth. The war could not be won. It wasn't a sudden revelation, but a creeping certainty, a slow erosion of hope that began as unease, turned into doubt, and finally settled into grim acceptance. These men, once wrapped in the illusion of invincibility, started to glimpse the abyss behind their early triumphs. They would still obey orders, still command their troops, still fight fiercely, but with the heavy knowledge that the end was already written. In the early summer of 1941, the Wehrmacht stood at its peak. In less than 2 years, Hitler's armies had swept through Poland, Norway, France, the Low Countries, and much of the Balkans. The generals who had spent the interwar years nursing resentment and frustration now felt vindicated. Their military doctrines, honed in bitter years of constraint, had worked. The world trembled before their precision and speed. When Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941, it seemed like the culmination of German military genius. Columns of tanks roared across the endless Soviet plains, and Field Marshal Fedor von Bock's Army Group Center advanced hundreds of kilometers within weeks. Prisoners flooded in by the hundreds of thousands. By autumn, many officers believed the war would soon end in triumph. Hitler's prophecy of crushing Bolshevism in a single campaign seemed within reach. But beneath the surface of confidence, a quieter unease took root. Some officers, veterans of the First World War, recognized a dangerous familiarity. The front was too wide, the logistics too fragile, and the supply lines dangerously overstretched. Heinz Guderian's spearheads raced far ahead of their supply convoys. Motorized divisions stalled for lack of fuel, and infantry lagged days behind. Yet Berlin demanded deeper advances into the vast Russian interior. By November 1941, as the first snow fell on exhausted troops, that unease hardened into dread. The Soviet Union had not collapsed. Fresh divisions appeared from the east. The Red Army, bloodied but unbroken, counterattacked outside Moscow. Temperatures plunged below freezing, equipment failed, and the once invincible Wehrmacht stalled for the first time. That winter, in field headquarters and forward dugouts, the first fatal doubts began to take hold. Officers who had believed in a short, decisive war now faced the grinding attrition they had sworn to avoid. Logistics were crippled, reserves depleted, morale brittle. Some whispered that the war was already unwinnable. Others pushed such thoughts away. But no one who survived the winter campaign of 1941 could mistake the truth. Germany was no longer fighting a campaign. It was trapped in a war of exhaustion against a foe it had underestimated in every way. The zenith of power, early successes and growing unease. In the summer of 1941, the Wehrmacht was at the height of its power. Just 2 years earlier, Hitler's armies had swept across Europe with breathtaking speed, conquering Poland, Norway, France, the Low Countries, and much of the Balkans. The generals who had spent the interwar years frustrated and constrained now felt vindicated. Their military doctrines, built on precision, speed, and overwhelming force, seemed unstoppable. The world watched in awe as German tanks and troops rolled across the continent, crushing opposition with ruthless efficiency. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, it was supposed to be the crowning achievement of German military strategy. Columns of panzers thundered across the vast plains of the Soviet Union, advancing hundreds of kilometers in a matter of weeks. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock's Army Group Center pushed deep into Soviet territory, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. The generals believed they were witnessing the final act of a lightning war that would destroy Bolshevism in a single campaign. But beneath the surface of this confidence, a quiet unease was growing. Some of the older officers, veterans of the First World War, recognized a dangerous pattern. The front was too wide, stretching across thousands of kilometers. Supply lines were fragile and overextended. Heinz Guderian's armored spearheads raced ahead of their fuel and ammunition convoys, leaving motorized divisions immobilized and infantry lagging days behind. Yet Berlin demanded relentless advances, pushing deeper into the vast and unforgiving Russian interior. By November 1941, as the first snow began to fall, that unease hardened into dread. The Soviet Union had not collapsed as expected. Instead, fresh divisions appeared seemingly out of nowhere, reinforcing the battered Red Army. Outside Moscow, the Soviets launched a fierce counterattack. Temperatures plunged well below freezing, and German equipment began to fail in the brutal cold. The Wehrmacht, once thought invincible, stalled for the first time. That winter was a turning point. In field headquarters and forward dugouts, the first fatal doubts took root. Officers who had believed in a short, decisive war now faced the grim reality of grinding attrition. Logistics were crippled, reserves depleted, and morale fragile. Some whispered that the war was already unwinnable. Others tried to push such thoughts away, clinging to hope. But no one who survived the winter campaign of 1941 could deny the truth. Germany was no longer fighting a swift campaign. It was trapped in a war of exhaustion against an enemy it had underestimated in every way. The generals' confidence was hollow, but they still obeyed orders. They still commanded their troops. Yet behind the scenes, the mood was shifting. The arrogance of early victories was giving way to a quiet fatalism. The Wehrmacht was no longer the unstoppable force it had seemed just months before. The war was becoming a slow, grinding battle of attrition, and the generals knew it. Winter of 1941. The turning point. The winter of 1941 was unlike any the Wehrmacht had faced before. After months of rapid advances and seemingly unstoppable momentum, the German army suddenly found itself grinding to a halt. The endless plains of the Soviet Union, once a stage for lightning-fast tank columns, became a frozen trap. Temperatures plunged far below freezing, and the harsh Russian winter exposed the limits of German planning and preparation. The soldiers, many ill-equipped for the brutal cold, struggled to keep their weapons and vehicles operational. Engines froze, lubricants thickened, and weapons jammed. The supply lines, already stretched thin by the vast distances, became even more vulnerable. Fuel shortages immobilized entire divisions, and food supplies dwindled. The Wehrmacht's logistical system, designed for rapid movement, was not built to sustain a prolonged campaign in such unforgiving conditions. But it wasn't just the weather that turned the tide. The Soviet Union, battered and bloodied, refused to collapse. Instead, it rallied. Fresh divisions, trained and equipped, poured into the front lines from the east. The Red Army, once thought broken, launched a fierce counteroffensive outside Moscow. The German forces, exhausted and ill-prepared, were pushed back for the first time. In the command posts and dugouts, the mood shifted dramatically. The confidence that had carried the Wehrmacht through its early victories gave way to a creeping dread. Officers who had once believed in a swift, decisive war now faced the grim reality of a long, grinding conflict. The war they had promised to win quickly was turning into a battle of attrition they had hoped to avoid. Some generals whispered in private that the war was already lost. Others refused to entertain such thoughts, clinging to hope or denial. But the signs were undeniable. The front was too wide, the enemy too resilient, and the supply lines too fragile. The Wehrmacht was no longer advancing. It was struggling to hold its ground. This winter marked the beginning of a slow unraveling. The Wehrmacht's failures in logistics and planning exposed a fatal flaw in Hitler's strategy: overconfidence and underestimation of the Soviet Union's capacity to resist. The generals, many of whom had once basked in the glow of early triumphs, now faced the harsh truth that the war was slipping beyond their control. Yet, despite the growing despair, the orders from Berlin remained relentless. Hitler demanded further advances, deeper into the Soviet interior, refusing to acknowledge the mounting crisis. The generals obeyed, but their confidence was hollow. They knew the risks, but they also knew disobedience was not an option. The winter of 1941 was more than just a season. It was a turning point. It shattered the myth of German invincibility and exposed the limits of the Wehrmacht's power. It was the moment when hope began to fade, replaced by a grim acceptance that the war would not be won quickly, or perhaps at all. As the snow fell and the cold tightened its grip, the Wehrmacht found itself trapped in a war it had not planned for. The swift victories of the past were now distant memories, replaced by the harsh reality of a brutal, exhausting conflict. The generals who had once commanded with certainty now faced the slow, painful realization that the tide was turning and that the end might already be written.